This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
my interviews with Gloria Steinem said, I never thought about daycare being an issue, right? Until I heard Shirley Chisholm talk about daycare and the importance of daycare, what that meant to working class women, and really what that meant to Black and Hispanic and Black and brown women.
A conversation on the ideas and words of Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to be elected to Congress in 1968 and the first Black woman to run for the presidential nomination within one of the two ruling parties. That was in 1972. Our guest for this conversation is Dr. Zinga A. Frazier, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College, and she is the editor of the book Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Christina Onnested. The Supreme Court has lifted restrictions on federal immigration arrests in Los Angeles, handing over another victory by conservative justices to President Donald Trump's mass deportation agenda. A lower court judge had found immigration agents were conducting roving patrols and indiscriminate arrests in Los Angeles, agreeing with claims federal agents were racially profiling people to pursue. The order barred agents from stopping people solely based on their race, language, or job or location. The plaintiffs include the U.S. citizens swept up in immigration stops. The Supreme Court lifted that restraining order. It was unexplained. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote in a concurrent decision, apparent ethnicity alone cannot furnish reasonable suspicion. However, he also wrote, it can be a relevant factor. He also suggested stops in which force is used could yet face more legal pushback. In a stinging dissent joined by two liberal colleagues, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote countless people in the Los Angeles area have been grabbed, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed simply because of their looks, their accents, and the fact they make a living by doing manual labor. Today, the court needlessly subjects countless more to these exact same indignities. Immigrant rights advocates today rallied in support of those some 500 workers who were swept up in an immigration raid at a Hyundai plant in Georgia.
Many of these people had legal work permits, yet they still felt intimidated, mistreated, and abused by ICE. Make no mistake, we cannot call ourselves a civilized society if the very people who build our homes, our cars, and our futures are treated this way. Almost 500 workers were arrested, including people from South Korea, Guatemala, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Workers have said that their phones were confiscated and that they were forced to sign documents. ICE agents, heavily armed officers, use both physical and psychological intimidation tactics.
Daniela Rodriguez, the executive director of Migrant Equity Southeast, said most of the people hired were hired by contractors or subcontractors. They're calling on Hyundai and the subcontractors to be held accountable, local officials to take action, and for due process for those arrested and for their release. A federal appeals court has upheld a civil jury's decision requiring President Donald Trump to pay more than $83 million to writer E. Jean Carroll. The court rejected Trump's appeal today, affirming the damages as fair and reasonable. The award stems from Trump's repeated social media attacks against Carroll after she accused him of sexual assault in the 1990s. A separate civil jury also awarded Carroll $5 million in a 2023 sexual assault and defamation case. Trump's lawyers had sought a new trial. The court's decision maintains their original judgment. Condemnation of the president's Weekend social media post that ramps up his threat to send National Guard troops and immigration agents to Chicago. An image parodies Apocalypse Now with an image of Trump's face on a military general in front of a city in flames as helicopters fly above. Trump wrote, "I love the smell of deportations in the morning." Chicago about to find out why it's called the Department of War. This after the president signed an executive order rebranding the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Illinois Senator Democrat Dick Durbin blasted the post and threats over the weekend.
His tweet this morning was disgusting. To suggest that the troops are coming into Chicago or that the Department of War is going to be engaged is an embarrassment.
The president seemed to walk back that statement, speaking to reporters.
We're not going to war. We're going to clean up our cities. We're going to clean them up so they don't kill 5 people every weekend. That's not war. That's common sense.
In Chicago, thousands rallied over the weekend against the potential deployment of National Guard troops to the third largest city in the country. Among the speakers at the rally, Francisco Amador, pastor of the New Life Community Church, and Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain of Live Free, Illinois.
Every single immigrant is a human. Every single immigrant has every single right to have their families stay together.
Trump has spent billions on federal guards and the militarization of our communities, pouring money into weapons and intimidation, and instead of investing in schools, hospitals, jobs, and housing. He has stripped us of vital resources meant to help us live, only to use them to try to break our spirits.
In Washington, D.C., thousands also rallied. Protesters marched with a banner that said, "End the occupation." National Guard troops have been deployed on their city streets for a month. Pakistani officials say rescuers and troops have evacuated more than 25,000 people from an eastern city as rivers rising threaten to flood the region. Floods have so far affected more than 4 million people in the Punjab province. Since July in Pakistan, floods have killed more than 900 people. Police in Nepal's capital of Kathmandu opened fire on demonstrators protesting a government attempt to regulate social media that blocked some of the world's largest platforms, including Facebook, X, and YouTube. At least 17 people were killed by authorities. Rallies swept the streets around the Parliament building. At least 145 people were arrested. Critics say it's an attempt at censorship. The Trump administration's asking the Supreme Court for an emergency order to keep billions of dollars in foreign aid frozen. Last month, the president said he would not spend $5 billion in congressionally approved aid. Last week, a district judge ruled that decision to withhold funding likely illegal. I'm Christina Onnested reporting for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. On March 26, 1969, Shirley Chisholm, who just was elected as this nation's first black woman to Congress, took to the floor of the House of Representatives, where she gave her inaugural address. And her inaugural address began like this, quote, "Mr. Speaker, on the same day President Nixon announced that he had decided the United States will not be safe unless we start to build a defense system against missiles, the Head Start program in the District of Columbia was cut back for the lack of money. As a teacher and as a woman, I do not think I will ever understand what kind of values can be involved in spending $9 billion, and more I am sure, on elaborate, unnecessary, and impractical weapons when several thousand disadvantaged children in the nation's capital get nothing." Again, that was Shirley Chisholm's inaugural address on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1969. Today we are going to be in conversation about the life and the words, and especially the speeches of Shirley Chisholm. My guest for this is Dr. Zinga A. Frazier. Zinga Frazier, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College. She is the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn Women's Activism. Recently served also as a historical consultant on the Netflix documentary Shirley. Dr. Fraser is also the curator of Shirley Chisholm at 100. Shirley Chisholm actually would turn 100 this year. And the exhibit is the first major museum exhibit on the life and legacy of Shirley Chisholm at the Museum of the City of New York. It opened in June of 2024. And Dr. Fraser is the editor of the book. It's called Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings. Zinga Fraser, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
I told you in the introduction, and I told you before we began, and I'll say it again here just at the beginning. I actually first really learned about Shirley Chisholm because when I was a Capitol Hill reporter, there is this wonderful portrait of her on the first floor of the house. And I remember I didn't even know who she was when I first saw it. I was much younger then. And I was like, who is this? And, I started to investigate a little bit. It was really amazing. But even that portrait, she sort of has a bit of a, if I recall correctly, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, she even has sort of a stern look at you. So she was expecting. Was that characteristic of her?
Yes and no. So I always have a kind of different depiction of the iconography, and that's why I think the museum curation allowed us to look at the breadth as well as the film. Chisholm was serious when she needed to be serious, but I always tell people Chisholm was really compassionate and fun-loving. When she wasn't taking care of business, but she definitely was someone who loved to smile a lot. So it's ironic that a lot of the iconography of Chisholm somewhat reflects, right, a more serious and stern person. I think there's a twofold in that, right? It's important because many people didn't think about her seriously when she was the first Black woman coming into a space that didn't know what to expect of someone of her caliber, as well as someone who's coming from the district in which she represented, right? And so it was important to maybe have a depiction of her so people took her more seriously. But then also, I think, limits, right, the totality of looking at Chisholm and her holistic framework. Because she was a school teacher, she wasn't stern and mean, right? Like that we're typical, right? Or she was really, she loved to dance. And that's why I liked, working on the film with Regina and John Ridley, because we could kind of provide a different way, and art allows us to provide a different perspective, right?
Now, I quoted her, just her first two paragraphs of the first speech that she gave after she was elected to Congress. And I thought it was important because I thought they were profound. She really set the tone right at the beginning.
Exactly. And I think it was something that she really belabored to talk about. She ran when she ran in 68 against the Vietnam War. And it was something that she thought about strategically, not only in terms of having a symbolic speech, but also saying that she would not also fund, she was saying, if we don't address the issues of Vietnam War, I will not vote for the appropriations bill that the administration was pushing forward until we make sure that funding goes to education and Head Start and all of those other things. She was very adamant in talking about how it was important to think about, the legacy of war, and also the importance of thinking about marginalized communities and who doesn't benefit from war. And those are, the people in her districts and other districts that look like hers.
And again, she's talking about a lack of funding for the Head Start program. She had a background in childhood development, didn't she?
Yeah, so she worked as a daycare administrator. She gets her master's from Columbia's Teachers College. She understood, even though she might have thought about doing something differently, in the time period of which she, graduates from Brooklyn College. So that's, that connection to the school in which I represent. Chisholm had limited abilities as a Black woman to go into something other than education. And she was invested in education. She believed in education, and she worked as a daycare administrator as well as someone who oversaw a number of schools during her time period at Brooklyn.
Let's talk about, tell me more about her campaign. Now, she already had served in New York State Assembly
Yes.
previously. So, and then she gets elected to Congress. You mentioned the Vietnam War. Was that the issue that propelled her to victory?
I don't know if it was the only issue, right? So when we think about what's happening in 60 and 68, she's running against James Farmer, right, who is a well-known civil rights activist. And she's running as someone who really understands and knows the district, right? Farmer wasn't from Brooklyn, even though he ran in Brooklyn. He moved to Brooklyn out of convenience because it was a fight to get the district, right? Brooklyn was so gerrymandered and the reapportionment in terms of ensuring that there wasn't a Black majority to vote for a representative. And so it was a long kind of drawn out battle of a lot of Black community members and activists and some elected officials to really fight for the first congressional district to represent an African American or someone of African descent from that area. And so when Chisholm runs, she runs around the issues that she knew were important to the district because she represented them, right? So everything from education, the Vietnam War, even police brutality, talking about the criminal justice system at times, as well as, really poverty. Poverty was, a major issue for her constituency. And so she's running around, to say that she was unbought and unbossed because a lot of the politicians of her time were, political hacks in some ways, who represented the Kings County machine, but didn't necessarily represent the people and their needs. And so that resonated with her constituency.
It somewhat reminds me, but you'll tell me if this is a good comparison or not, of the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But was it a surprise that Shirley Chisholm won?
Yes, I mean, I think it was a surprise. She wasn't backed by the leadership, right? The Democratic leadership, a number of them. She was backed by like a progressive and new and different leadership that came out of the district. And it was new not only because of what they were saying and a lot of the platform that they were, putting forth, but it was also new in terms of women being in leadership capacity, right? And it was one of the first Brooklyn districts that you saw, at least party clubs, what they would call them, right? Machine clubs, that had a diverse population. It was diverse racially, but it was also diverse in terms of gender. And so, yes, I think you can see some of the same comparisons to Ocasio in terms of not being the likely winner, and also going up against, a male strong figure. The only thing that it doesn't kind of resonate is that, there was somebody already in place when Ocasio won. This was a new district, so there wasn't someone who was already in political power. And then also what James Farmer's, his fatal mistake was his decision to run against Chisholm in a campaign that was really grounded in a certain kind of machismo and masculinity. And Chisholm was a strategic woman, and she understood the people who actually voted in the district, Black women, 2-1. And she knew that that was her base. She worked with Black women. Black women were the reason why she even ran. They came to her house with their coins and said, you need to run for this seat. And so while Farmer was saying you need to vote a man into Congress, Chisholm was saying Black women have been the bread and butter of this district and of the politics of our community. And I am one of those women. And so women, a lot of women saw themselves in her and voted her into Congress.
I should know this, and I don't, but James Farmer, is he black?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
Yes, yes. He's if you've ever seen I forgot, I think it's Remember the not the Titans. It's Denzel. Um he played in the film that depicted James Farm and other debate students in Texas. So he's a well-known member of the Brooklyn well, he wasn't a member of the Brooklyn Corps, but he was head of Corps and did a number of the civil rights freedom rides that people are familiar during that time.
And so it's very interesting. It's black women that really turn out to vote for Shirley Chisholm. So within a black community, this new district that's created in New York, gender is sort of at the heart. And this is an important theme in the collection of writings that you have gathered by Shirley Chisholm of both, the intersection of gender and race.
Yes, and class too. Chisholm comes from working class Caribbean immigrants. Her parents were from Barbados, and so she represented, a constituency of working people who are trying to reimagine what America means for them, and to, really fight against the inequities, inequalities that they fought during that time.
Well, we're going to talk about her own ideas and through a lot through speeches, the ideas that she sort of her own philosophy even of things that she's formulated. Before we get there, though, let me ask about her intellectual underpinnings and influences. And they begin right at home, as they oftentimes do. You mentioned her parents were from, respectively, Barbados and Guyana. My understanding is they were also followers of Marcus Garvey.
Yes, her dad was a Garveyite. Well, he wasn't in rank and file as most people would consider, but he went to a number of Garvey meetings and celebrations in Brooklyn. And he definitely followed his philosophy. Reading some of the newspapers. She would always talk about her father sitting at the kitchen table, talking about politics that was happening throughout the Caribbean. And of course, the importance and the influence of Garvey having an impact on the racial pride that she expressed as a young child and throughout her life.
And Shirley Chisholm is born in the 1920s, but when the Great Depression hits, she actually goes to Barbados to live with her grandmother and has an early education in Barbados' educational system, which has a very profound impact on her. She would say this later on in life.
Yeah, I mean, most of us are familiar with the immigration story that is coming from another place to the United States. And I always talk about the reverse immigration story for Chisholm. And it was important not only in terms of Chisholm's understanding of what it meant to be somewhat impoverished, right? Because it was the impact of the Depression that made her do this long voyage with her mother and her sisters, right? But it also influences her understanding and perspective of colonialism and imperialism, right? And the ways in which we think about racism doesn't operate in the same way for Chisholm early in that age, right? Because she's in a, what we would consider to be a self-contained kind of safe space in Barbados, right? Everyone looked like her. There wasn't, these contentious debates around race. But that doesn't mean that she didn't see the difference, right? And so she understood that it's still something different to go to school in Barbados and be engrossed in what? British culture, right? History, the language, singing All Hail to the Queen. All of those things are the impacts and the influences of imperialism and colonialism for Chisholm. So she understands that, and it becomes a backdrop of her assessment when she comes back to the United States, right? And when she goes to college and she talks about the importance of having Negro education, and some of those speeches are in the book, and also the importance of Black studies, right? And so she is bringing all of these things that are influencing her own kind of ideological understandings, as well as the debates of the time.
And this is a time when there is a push on college campuses for ethnic studies, black studies.
Yeah, I mean, she had to fight just to get at Brooklyn College to have a Negro Week, for example, right? That's what becomes Black History Month, right? And also fighting for courses that talk about Black people, right? Not just in the United States, but throughout the diaspora. And so all of those things, even if we talk about it today, and I tell my students all the time, there was a fight at Brooklyn College to get what? A Black Studies department. Chisholm puts up her house for some of the students who, once she's elected, who are protesting. On campus. So she's very much ingrained.
Puts up her house. What does that mean?
She literally puts up a bond for some students who were arrested at Brooklyn College. She wasn't at Brooklyn College at the time. She was, of course, much older, but she puts up a bond for her house for a number of the students who were arrested in protest at the school.
Are there other important as a young woman, are there other important political and intellectual influences that is important to know to understand Shirley Chisholm?
I think it's important to know a little bit when she gets a little older, but she's very much a well-read person. I don't think people, understand how much she loved reading and she loved learning. And she's influenced by a number of Black feminist writers of the time, everyone from Toni Morrison to Frances Beale. When she writes some of her works around Black feminism, and before we even have the term that Kimberly Crenshaw frames as intersectionality, she understands the handicaps that existed in terms of race and gender. And it provided her a different way to navigate and think about the spaces in which she was inhabiting and some of the conflicts that she might have had with Black male leadership and even, women's leadership as well. And so I would say Black feminist writings, fictional and non-fictional, had a profound impact on her.
I mean, this is also during a time which we have a Black lesbian literature movement, literary movement with people like June Jordan and Audre Lorde. Was there any intersection with Shirley Chisholm and figures like these?
Yes, I mean, she definitely had a copy of some of Audre Lorde's work. And because Audre Lorde also was someone who was at Hunter College and the city universities in New York, they definitely, cross paths. So she definitely had an affinity and a connection to them. Florence Kennedy was a lesbian woman as well. And she worked with a number of, these women around abortion rights. I think what also is important to understand with the Black feminist writers of that time, they weren't just writing in the ivory tower, right? They were writers, but they were also a number of them were also social activists. And so they would definitely come into contact with Chisholm, because Chisholm was one of the first Black women to support abortion and was a founding member of NARAL in New York City, and had a leadership position. And so those things were very important to her. She understood, even though she never had children, right? She provides a different context to her white feminist counterparts in terms of talking about reproductive justice versus just talking about the freedom to choose, right? She would say that Black women, in particular Black and Hispanic women, were the ones who, bared the brunt of medical racism, right? And understanding what it meant around issues around reproduction, but also the support that these women needed, in particular with the children that they did have, right? And so making sure that they had a certain kind of Black or Hispanic, a marginalized framework in terms of reproductive health. And so we see now that we're talking about the problems that specifically Black and Brown women have in terms of infant mortality and reproductive health for them, even in the moment that we're talking in. Chisholm is talking about that in the 60s, in the early 1970s.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the life, the works, and the ideas of Shirley Chisholm. Our guest is Dr. Zinga A. Frazier. Zinga Frazier, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College, and she is the editor of the book Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings. Dr. Frazier, she would serve in Congress for some time, but early on, is she an outlier on the Hill?
Yes, my second book, Sister Insider, Sister Outsider, also connecting to Audre Lorde as well, right? And it's a comparative study of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm and Black women's politics in the post-civil rights era. Chisholm is who I consider to be a sister outsider, right? She works outside of the lines and the terrains of political power. She knows in many ways that working on the inside limits her, at least according to her. And so she is finding different ways to navigate those political spaces to also obtain political power. So she's definitely an outlier in everything she did. From the moment she gets to Congress and she protests being on the forestry committee and agriculture committee because she wanted to be on the education committee or the veteran affairs committee. And so she is the outlier in terms of she doesn't abide by the rules of Congress or institutions of power.
How is she treated on the Hill, especially in the earlier years?
The earlier years were very difficult for her. She doesn't begrudge or talk about it as much. But in my research, I found that the earlier years were, of course, an adjustment period, at times lonely. And the reason why they were a bit lonely was because Chisholm wasn't solely because she's a Black woman, but it was also because she was an outlier in terms of how she approached Congress and how she approached her colleagues, right? She wasn't someone who, loved going to the parties and some of those things, even though she, of course, did a number of social things. I think much later it becomes easier for her to be there, and she's seen as a senior member, and there are also the incorporation of other Black women like Barbara Jordan, who comes in right in 72, and Barbara Yvonne Brathwaite Burke, who comes in with Jordan, and then you have Cardis Collins. So they also have a collection of Black women who are in Congress. And she also
Is she a leader? Is she a leader of that group?
I would say it's a mixture, right? Barbara Jordan and even Yvonne Brathwaite Burke are very leaders in their own right. I think they collectively work together. They looked at her as, the first, but it wasn't, we're going to bow to bow to Shirley Chisholm. But I think a number of women, of course, much later in the 80s, the late 70s, they see her as the senior member of the congressional, because she's a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And she has really good relationships with some of the men of the Congressional Black Caucus, Ronald Dellums, Parren Mitchell, others who were, really good friends to her. And they work collectively well together.
Ron Dellums, Oakland. That's where I am. That's where I'm talking to you from.
Yeah. And Barbara Lee, all of those people. She becomes a mentor to Barbara Lee in Oakland, and she really has a really good relationship with California, extensively. She campaigns in California a lot, and she works, as you know, with the Black Panthers and other activists in California. So it was a space that she saw connections to ideologically.
I mean, she's the one that got Barbara Lee involved in politics.
Yes. So she meets Barbara Lee at Mills College, and she was like, first, can you vote? And Barbara Lee says, I never even thought about voting. That wasn't my purview. And then she, drafts her to come to work for her on her campaign, as well as a number of, Barbara Lee isn't the only one. There are like 3, 4 Black women who also were from Oakland who worked on her campaign.
And of course, Barbara Lee's retiring this year from the House of Representatives and will be a historic figure, I think, in her own right. I think she'll always be remembered for that one no vote against authorization for the war on terrorism just a few days after September 11th. So you mentioned Shirley Chisholm is a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Oftentimes, the Congressional, especially when I was on the Hill, the Congressional Black Caucus was oftentimes referred to as the conscience of the Congress. How was she, and then this other group of Black women lawmakers received within the caucus?
I think for the most part, Chisholm had of course, there were differences in terms of strategies, and that's amongst everyone in the CBC. So I think there is a way to say that at times she had tenuous relationships with the members of the CBC. And because she's such an individual, at times working collectively with people was not always her strong suit. I do think that, though, she did work well because of the CBC's mandate, especially in the early 70s, was really about representing a national Black constituency. It wasn't saying, I just represent Oakland, I just represent Bedford-Stuyvesant. It was saying that we are, as you said, the conscience of Congress, but we also represent a national group of Black people in the United States, but they also thought about the diaspora, like someone like Charles Payne, who did a lot of, and Leland Mitchell, who did a lot of work in terms of Africa, right, in the diaspora. And so I think Chisholm really saw the importance of collectively working with the CBC and that their ability to connect to this large population. And that also, Black people, whether you were in Alabama or you were in Nashville or wherever, you looked at the CBC as an important mechanism in political power, right? They would get letters, not just from their constituents. Yeah. And they also kind of felt responsible for that, right? And so it's very different than any other members, right, who are just really supposed to work for their own districts. And so that's also the added labor, right, and the added weight that Black members of Congress always, at least, up until now, I'm not sure, right? But during the 70s, felt a responsibility for. And Chisholm definitely felt that responsibility.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, as the first Black woman to serve in Congress.
Yeah.
This must have certainly been true for her.
And she makes a decision to stay longer than she wanted to, because there was a moment where she was the only one left, right? Until we had a new influx of those who came in the 80s. So she was very cognizant of saying, my voice and my perspective and representing a large constituency of people would be missed if I'm not here or there isn't someone else to take my place.
So you get a number of Black women who get elected, beginning with Shirley Chisholm, and then later, a few years later, you mentioned Barbara Jordan, a few others. But then there would be a lull?
Yes, there was a lull like in the 1980s, before you have Maxine Waters and Eleanor, before you have another kind of new wave who are now senior members, right? Yeah. Yes, so definitely there was a lull, and she makes a decision to stay a little bit longer. And also, as much as the narrative and the collective memory of Chisholm is, oh, everyone loved her. They didn't love her at the end in the district. So she was also, up against a number of people saying, we don't see certain things in our district or all of these other things. Also because of the changing leadership, presidential leadership. The Reagan years were very difficult for her, as well as that district. And so she had some battle wounds, right, that she had for representing the district as long as she did.
And then as is a common feature when somebody represents a district for a long time and is in Congress for a long time, there are also feelings, and she was accused later on, my understanding anyways, that she was accused later on by some as being too cozy with Democratic the leadership at the end.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, I think they felt leaders in her own district felt like she wasn't able to get the bread and butter constituency needs that she had been, advocating for a number of years. And some of those things are right, but also some of those things are also reflective of not being able to pass certain things in Congress, as well as the limitations in New York City politics as well. So, Koch and all of those other members were very kind of detrimental to the Black constituency, Black and Hispanic constituency. But you also see Chisholm still very much advocating for example, Haitian refugees, right? And talking against the discriminatory practices, immigration practices that the national government had, in particular against Haiti and Cuba, right? And all of that dealing with race, saying, Cubans weren't seen as refugees, right? They weren't discriminated against like Haitian members, who were coming across the seas, and you're saying, they're on a banana boat, all of the kind of racialized language that were connected to Haiti. And she also understanding the rich history of Haiti and independence and the contentious relationship that Haiti has always had with the United States, right?
Did she see and talk of the United States as being an empire?
Yes, she did. And there are a number of speeches in the book that talked about the United States and the imperial rule and the ways in which it operated both nationally and internationally, and understanding that connection and the importance of marginalized constituencies, understanding the way in which the United States operates. And how it's connected, or it's similar to the same playbook, as she would say, to the British imperial rule.
Did this make her an outlier on the Hill as well?
I think it did. I think a lot of Chisholm's understanding of the ways in which the world operated, and calling out political cronyism and the inability of the of course government to be kind of reflexive, as well as having apologies, right, for the way in which they operated and disseminated various nation states internationally, and playing a role in creating and maintaining war, was something that Chisholm, said was a hypocrisy, right? That, this American exceptionalism that the United States government operated during that time, and the hypocrisy of the United States also not addressing its own ills, as people would describe it, in terms of the racism, the sexism, as well as how they operated with these marginalized constituencies.
I do want to go back to, I should have brought this up earlier, I do want to go back to just sort of this national appeal that she had, that you were mentioning, and this was also true for other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, but certainly for Shirley Chisholm, where people outside of her district were writing to her and were following her on the Hill. Is this an important element for why she runs for the Democratic nomination for president in 1972?
Yes, I think that what Chisholm is doing in 72 when she's running is she's literally going to campuses, right? She's probably one of the most well sought after, speaker, right? So she's going to campuses and speaking, and young people really are her motivating factor of running. Along with some other women who, say we think you should run, but really young people, and specifically young people who didn't look like her, right? Young whites. Um, a lot of them were a part of the peace movement. A number of them were men, right? So the unlikelihood of the Chisholm voter, right? And saying, why don't you run? You're the one who's talking about getting us out of Vietnam. You're the one that's talking about abortion and rights. You're the one that's talking about even environmentalism, right? She literally has a 10-point plan in terms of talking about what we consider now to be climate change, right? So she's really a visionary, right, in terms of thinking about it and how it connected to white liberals, as well as progressive Black women and men. And so those are the constituencies, and that was really a national appeal, right? And people really kind of reframing what does 72 is a really great moment because everybody is thinking that this election has the possibility of changing everything for everyone, right? There is also a certain kind of optimism. 18-year-olds are voting. Everyone is thinking we actually can make a play. When we think about what happens with Fannie Lou Hamer, and that convention and how gruesome that convention was, right? And the rules changed within the Democratic Party. Chisholm is able to say this is a moment unlike any other, and she was right. She was really good in terms of her own political instincts. She understood that if there was ever a time, and I will agree, if there was ever a time for a Shirley Chisholm to run for the presidency, it was 72. Before 72, she would never have made it anywhere near anything, right? And Fannie Lou Hamer told us that, right? And then even after 72, there's still a humdrum that doesn't allow her. So 72 really was the optimal time for her running. And, getting back to your question, it was this mass coalition of marginalized people that made Chisholm think that there was a time for us to collectively work together against this fascist, right?
She would use the term fascist?
I have one part, it's not in a speech, but it's in an interview that she did look at Nixon as a fascist. But she definitely looked at Nixon as, what people would consider to be Trump in this political moment, as someone who has usurped his political power, who has done everything wrong, especially for marginalized people. And he was someone who they had to fight against. And she was very adamant about running against Nixon, and also being in a coalition of other Democrats who understood that Nixon was I'm trying to find the best words to describe him. He was an evil, right? In terms of democracy. And so, yeah.
Huh. I think you really hit on an important point about the 1972 election that I haven't actually done enough reflection about myself. We've done a number of shows about the 1968 convention, and you're referencing that, right? The 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago was a complete fiasco. And then we do get rule changes that happen within the Democratic Party to make the primary process more democratic. And in 1972, we have this moment. We have this moment of Shirley Chisholm running for president. We have this moment of George McGovern, who ends up winning the nomination. There's also a lot of excitement about George McGovern. And it is interesting to think about 1972. I don't think we put enough attention on what was happening in 1972. And of course, Richard Nixon ends up winning in a landslide in that election as well. So, sort of you can see see the backlash, which always comes after there is some movement forward.
Progression, exactly. And the fear of what that progression looks like. And McGovern, he's in charge of the rules, right? So he had an advantage that people don't necessarily talk about. He was on the Rules Committee after 68. So
it was called the Fraser McGovern Commission.
Yes, definitely.
You have an entire, a big part of your book is also Shirley Chisholm on feminism. Tell me about Shirley Chisholm and the feminist movement of her time. It's complicated.
It is complicated. I think for Chisholm, she redefines feminism for her and how it looked differently than her white feminist counterparts. Chisholm was always actively talking about the blind spots within feminism or mainstream feminism. And that's why I think I spent so much time in the introduction looking at Chisholm as an intellectual, as well as her connections to Black feminist writers, and rebranding or reframing a Black feminism that wasn't, Chisholm's older, right? So she's not Angela Davis, right? Or some of the other Black feminists who emerged in the 1970s. But she, so in some ways she's seen as old school, if that makes sense. She's not wearing an afro, she's wearing her wig, she's wearing her suits and, colorful suits, though they're quite fashionable.
You wear them to church.
Right, but she looks, it's similar to the ways in which, people talk about Ella Baker, right? She doesn't look like the radicals that she teaches how to be radical, right? But her ideology is radical, right? So it's not, don't take her in terms of just the way in which she presents herself, because she's coming from a certain era, and so is Chisholm, is coming from a certain era that looks a little bit differently, but she's a feminist, right? Ella Baker is a feminist. She redefines what it looks like for Black women of a certain age, but even beyond, to kind of think about how do you grapple with the issues around sexism and misogyny, and also allowing Black women to see themselves in her vicariously. Chisholm, yes, she's married, but Chisholm would always say that, she didn't abide by the gender norms. She didn't, right? Even in her own life.
How so?
She's, her husband, who was a Jamaican immigrant himself, but Chisholm, doesn't make the decision to have to be a housewife or to do some of all of the kind of domestic labor things. She was very focused when she runs for political office, right? And also knowing that she was the person in her relationship who was really probably going to be the person who was out front. Everyone knew the spotlight. She doesn't marry another congressional member or, a wealthy businessman. She, marries someone who would in some ways be in her shadows. So they had to be a certain, take a certain person, whether a man or woman, for that matter, right? To abide, to understand her connections, to not abiding by certain kind of gender norms. So I think Chisholm allowed us to see what a Black feminist looked like, both in action and in words, and how she thinks ideologically about it, but also how she lived her life.
Was there tension between that and what we think a white feminist?
Well, I think the tension with white feminists for Chisholm was the lack of diversity. So her main issue with white feminists of the time, especially activists, was their inability to talk about race, class, and gender in a comprehensive way. as well as ensuring that there was representation, right? Chisholm would always say, I do not want to be the only person on a panel. Right. I mean, there are a couple of speeches that she even wrote for Miss Magazine where she was like, you can't talk about feminism and only have one Black person at a conference. You know, Audre Lorde, a lot of Black feminists really resented the ways in which they were used or seen as tokens to provide a perspective versus collectively working around the issues that these women had. You know, Black women are not talking about just, I don't want to be a housewife, right? That wasn't the perspective of them, right? Even though she gets along with, you know, people like Betty Friedan and others, Black women are working. So you have to have an agenda that talks to Black working class Hispanic women versus talking to a middle class, you know, white centered framework of what feminists look like for them. And so there were definite differences that existed between Chisholm and the women she understood and their lived experiences. And Chisholm understood what those lived experiences look like. You know, what it looked like to be a domestic worker, whether you were in California or in the Upper East Side in New York City. You know, those women, as she would say when she wrote as well as proposed the legislation for 24-hour daycare centers. And my interviews with Gloria Steinem said, I never thought about daycare being an issue, right? You know, until I heard Shirley Chisholm talk about daycare and the importance of daycare, what that meant to working class women, and really what that meant to Black and Hispanic and Black and brown women. And so, you know, interviewing her and talking to her about the perspective that Shirley Chisholm brought, and also the importance, like I said, about reproductive health, and saying that, you know, every woman who wants to have a child is about the health. And how do we support those women who have children through daycare, through education, through Head Start, knowing the importance that she provided for those perspectives, I think really transforms how we think about feminism then and how we think about it today.
That's really interesting what Gloria Steinem said to you about Shirley Chisholm. Did Shirley Chisholm, during her political life, did she have the backing of mainstream feminist groups?
I think there were times where she did, right? She's a part of the Women's Political Caucus. She's one of the founding members with Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem, and she worked collectively with a number of them, right? But there were also times where it was contentious between her and Bella Abzug and others. You know, some of those were ideological differences, some were personal. But I do think, you know, if there was one particular person who showed how to actually navigate or be in those spaces collectively, she did work with them. But she also worked with other Black feminist organizations as well. And, you know, saw the importance of having the two, but also, you know, as I would say, the blind spots that existed within the feminist movement.
Dr. Zinga A. Frazier has joined us for a conversation about the life, the ideas, and the speeches and the writings of Shirley Chisholm. Zinga Frazier is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College. She is the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn Women's Activism. She is also the co-curator of the Shirley Chisholm at 100, Changing the Face of Democracy, the first major museum exhibition on the life and legacy of Shirley Chisholm at the Museum of the City of New York. How long will that exhibit remain?
Till July 2025.
Till July 2025. So people, if they're in New York, have a chance to see this. Good. And of course, you are also the editor of the book, Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings. Dr. Frazier, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much.
Protect KPFA at all costs means standing guard over one of the last truly independent media outposts. No corporate leash, no government filter, no billionaire puppeteers. Unbought and unbossed. It's a call to action, a mindset, a line in the sand. Defend truth tellers, amplify the unheard, and keep the airwaves free for the people. We've got 59,000 watts of radical truth, and we're not turning it down for anyone.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere at kpfa.org.